Hello, in this video I kind of want to continue and finish off this particular portion of that we've been talking about in terms of reading Bataille on the negative versus policy teams, so that we can move into the next portion of the series where we talk about how policy teams should better respond to Bataille. But in this video I wanted to kind of finish talking about some of the concepts I was talking about before in the last one, where I was discussing various ways that Bataille can be used on the neg. In this video I want to get a little bit more in depth into maybe some of the ways that you could particularly find points of offense that I've kind of like set out the framing for in the last video that you should definitely check out. And the one before that, if you haven't, that was like really the introduction to some of the central concepts that I'll be using to talk about behind these videos. These videos are really to like brainstorm and think about different ways that you can utilize some of the theories that we've already talked about in earlier videos. And so you should definitely make sure you should tune into this before you tune into these in order to give yourself some context to the conversation that is kind of happening here. But yeah, for this video I definitely want to talk about the link debate, the permutation, impact comparison debating, and the alternative. I think all four of these are really interesting spots for Bataille, and I think they're really interesting places that Bataille kind of has some advantages that I think some other authors, like if you compare it to like maybe like the Baudrillard series that we did before, there are definitely some differences in maybe the takes that I might have on like how you should be exploring these two authors and the ways you use them. And I think there are a lot of ways that even if Bataille isn't read on its own, that it can be read alongside a lot of other criticisms, even sometimes when people read Baudrillard or other criticisms, to make help diversify the link argument. And so even being able to kind of respond to some of the stuff that I'll be talking about in this video is kind of particularly important for like whatever type of like maybe critique that involves postmodernism you'll be seeing. So for the link debate, I think that there are some really interesting places that you can take the link debate. Obviously the link debate is dependent on the app, but I want to talk about a couple of areas that I think are like the strongest areas where Bataille has like link arguments. The first, I think, that is like its most generic argument is the argument that Bataille is making about life and death. Bataille critiques the idea that like human productivity, or that like our kind of telos should be towards the salvation of life or the protection and production of human life, because he's making so many arguments about how that relies on the kind of like logic of the restricted economy and kind of secures and continues the existence of the restricted economy. And so a lot of the arguments that he kind of pushes in the context of death, especially to the difference between being and becoming, are really pertinent here and are really relevant against a wide range of affirmatives. It's a stance that you can take on a pretty good any affirmative that like takes a stance on like why life should be preserved. I think that this argument is a lot less effective against soft left ads that are talking about particular marginalized communities, because I think that's like I think that the type of argument that Bataille is making in that context just isn't contextual to like the particular conditions that they're talking about, and so it kind of comes off as like two ships passing in the night, or not really the type of arguments that you want to end up making. But I do think it's a lot of other like maybe like big stick apps that this is like a place where you can definitely start a lot of your link ground in terms of just indicting the kind of base values that justify the existence of the plain text in the first place. The next thing that I think is like really interesting, if you end up debating apps that are about climate change, or you ended up debating apps that are even on, I think, this upcoming water topic about like just resource development and the way that we think about the usage of natural resources, I think it's a really interesting place that Bataille has a lot to say about in terms of like how we think about the particular like production of scarcity and deployment of resources, and the way that relates to the preservation of the restricted economy. The restricted economy attempts to control these different forms of resources, etc., and the way that impacts like how we think about like human life and our relationship to like these resources as a whole, right, and their existence as like also like natural kind of like phenomena. And I think being able to really like speak in depth to like that can really apply to a wide range of affirmatives that kind of take that softer left turn in terms of like thinking about the ways in which like the way that they kind of like redisperse or attempt to get rid of scarcity still allows the kind of restricted economy and the kind of politics that like it induces to like remain in place. And I think that can be a place where you also find like a really good way to debate a wide range of the apps that you might see on the upcoming topic. In terms of the permutation debate, I think the permutation debate is a particularly interesting one, because I think that a lot of the times that teams will really, when they debate Bataille, they can like make interesting arguments by saying that the more the permutation doesn't make sense, the more it kind of represents the type of luxury that's taken up by the alternative. But I definitely think that you can kind of refuse this maybe on the basis of some of the framing stuff that you did above. I think that you should say that like that their attempt to do the permutation isn't like for no reason, that it is maybe an attempt to capture from the perspective of the restricted economy. And I think that you want to make a bunch of arguments about like why their understanding of the like what it would mean to actually kind of like have these things exist in the same world, does it actually do justice to like the power of your criticism. And I think leaning on some of the stuff that I talked about the last video in terms of the framing of that thesis is really how you make this stuff as particularly pertinent against the permutation. I think the permutation has a lot of problems because maybe against its argument, because I think there are a lot of like really hard articulation of a permutation that looks like what a permutation looks like outside of the context that I just spoke about, like what it would actually look like for a permutation to maybe take up something similar to the alternative. And so in that case, I think that you're maybe in a much stronger place, but I definitely think it's somewhere that you still want to like spend time on and develop like really strong arguments that kind of flow from your framing and thesis arguments before. In terms of impact comparison, I think that impact comparison is a particularly important place for Bataille just because he has so many good critiques of the way in which like impact calculus is done normatively and how the restricted economy kind of controls how we evaluate like what our relationship to like what the value of human life is. And I think there are so many like interesting arguments that he kind of makes about why the idea that we should kind of like exist in such a way to only continue to produce and remain human life regardless of like what that means ethically definitely is something that like falls like really in line with a lot of the critiques that he's making, both about like humans at the level of subject formation and humanity at the level of like how we come to know our relationship to various economies. And so I think in this place you can definitely make a lot of arguments in terms of impact comparison about why their kind of like justification for how we save life is actually a justification for the continued production of like scarcity, violence, etc. And I think in that vein you actually have a lot of ground to maybe work off of in terms of like how you want the impact comparison debate to go, and even like ways in which you may not be able to articulate impacts on the same register or particularly comparatively, but how you can do so in such a way that at least gives you ground to like refuse or build more link arguments that diversify your offense across the flow by producing and executing it on this particular part of the debate. I think that in terms of the alternative, this is a place where I think that this debate gets really interesting because I think that there are definitely a lot of ways that you could think about Bataille. I think that Bataille can definitely be a lot of has a lot of things that's interesting ways to talk about the way in which we use luxury and the way in which we think about different folds and uses of excess. And I think that exploring a lot of these ways could definitely come to like maybe some good examples of like what it actually means to like use luxury within like everyday understanding or means of how we like organized life. And I think in that sense, if you can really grasp some really good examples, then it could be a place where you actually have a really interesting kind of like impact turn feel kind of debate with like the frame of how the aff is kind of thinking about how we should go about living in the world at the level of like subject formation. And I think in that route there are a lot of places to go, but I think if you think that kind of like involves you needing to like address or like create a whole bunch of terminology or produce like a whole bunch of like explanation that isn't really tied to your framing and thesis, then there's definitely a route that you can go down about just why refusing to kind of do the aff and refusing to like evoke debate as productive space also does the same type of work that you kind of want to explain when having the power of an alternative that will really explore maybe some more method-based stuff. And I think both ways will really give you some wiggle room for like ways that you can work. And hopefully this video was kind of helpful for you thinking about how you can use Bataille on the negative, and hopefully you'll tune into the videos where I start talking about what I think about Bataille on the affirmative and what I think about how policy teams should respond to the Bataille that I'll be doing next. Thanks.